My name is Harold Weaver, and I am 79 years old. 6 weeks ago, my son told his wife, in front of me, at a family dinner celebrating their first wedding anniversary, that his father was just a broke old veteran living off a small pension, someone she shouldn't expect much from financially if they ever needed help down the road. What my son didn't know, and what his wife certainly had no way of knowing, was that the actual discharge papers sitting in a cedar box in her own grandmother's attic, papers belonging to a man she'd never met, her own late grandfather, carried my signature at the bottom, from a decision I made 38 years ago that determined whether that man would spend the rest of his life with dignity or without it. If you've ever been quietly written off as insignificant by someone who never bothered to ask about your actual history, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my son wrong for underestimating me. It's about the strange, quiet way the past sometimes reaches forward across decades to connect people who never knew they were already tied together. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this connection came to light. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that dinner table, because otherwise a simple set of discharge papers won't carry the weight they're actually supposed to carry. I enlisted in the Army in 1965, 18 years old, out of a small town outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning home in 1969, physically intact but carrying, like so many men of my generation, a particular weight I've spent the following 5.5 decades learning how to manage rather than fully resolve. I stayed in the Army after that, finding, in the structure and purpose it provided, something I genuinely wasn't sure I could replicate in civilian life, and I built the remainder of my career, over the following 22 years, primarily in personnel and administrative command, work that most people, understandably, find considerably less interesting to discuss than direct combat service, but that carried its own particular, significant weight. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of that administrative work, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later. For the final 11 years of my career, I served in a role responsible for reviewing and finalizing discharge classifications for soldiers, separating from service, under circumstances that required additional review, cases involving disciplinary infractions, medical complications, or other factors that made a soldier's exact discharge status, honorable, general, or something less favorable, a matter requiring careful, individual judgment rather than simple administrative processing. I remember the specific weight of that office, small and windowless, stacks of files accumulating on my desk each week, each one representing a young man whose entire future hung on the specific judgment I was tasked with exercising, judgment that had to balance legitimate accountability for genuine misconduct against a fair, contextual understanding of circumstances that a purely mechanical review process might miss entirely. I want to be honest about the actual weight of that work, because I think it's easy for people to assume administrative roles carry less consequence than combat roles, and in some ways that's true. But in other ways, the decisions I made in that office shaped the entire remaining trajectory of young men's lives just as significantly as any decision made under fire. A general discharge instead of a dishonorable one meant a soldier retained access to veterans' benefits, could hold his head up in his hometown, had a genuine chance to rebuild a life that one difficult incident hadn't necessarily disqualified him from entirely. I took that responsibility seriously, reviewing each case with the specific attention I believed those young men's futures deserved, understanding that a signature at the bottom of a piece of paper could mean the difference between a man spending the rest of his life with dignity or without it. I remember specific evenings, staying late at that office long after most of the base had gone quiet, rereading witness statements and medical documentation multiple times, wanting to be certain I was making the correct call rather than simply the convenient or expedient one. I retired from the Army in 1991 as a command sergeant major, and I want to be clear that this particular chapter of my career, unlike direct combat, produced no medals, no dramatic stories, Simply the quiet, largely invisible knowledge that I'd tried, across those 11 years, to make careful, fair decisions about young men's futures during some of the most difficult moments of their military careers. I met my wife Ruth in 1970, shortly after returning from my second tour, and we married the following year. Ruth was a school teacher, patient and perceptive in ways that complemented my own more reserved temperament, and she carried, throughout our 43 years of marriage until her passing, a genuine understanding that certain parts of my career simply weren't meant to be discussed in detail, an understanding she never pushed against, trusting instead that whatever weight I carried from those years was mine to manage in my own time and my own way. We had one son, Gregory, born in 1973, and I want to be honest that raising him, particularly during the years I spent stationed at various postings while continuing that administrative career, created its own particular distance between us, one that I don't think either of us fully addressed until very recently. I remember specific stretches of Gregory's childhood, long hours at that windowless office reviewing case files that I could never adequately explain to him. Coming home some evenings carrying a particular quiet weight that Ruth would gently manage on my behalf, offering Gregory some general, age-appropriate reassurance without ever revealing details I wasn't prepared to share even with her fully. Ruth passed 8 years ago, and since then, I've lived a quiet retirement outside of Tulsa, close enough to Gregory that I see him and, more recently, his wife regularly, though our relationship has carried, over the years, a particular quality of surface-level closeness without much genuine depth. A pattern I think both of us contributed to in our own ways, comfortable enough with routine, pleasant conversation, but rarely venturing into anything requiring more sustained vulnerability or curiosity from either side. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never discussed the specifics of my administrative career with Gregory in any real detail. Partly this reflected genuine professional discretion, given that many of the specific cases I reviewed involved confidential personnel matters that weren't mine to discuss casually, even decades later. But partly, if I'm honest with myself, it reflected a broader pattern in how I approached my entire military career with my own family, a tendency to discuss it only in the vaguest possible terms, letting Gregory absorb a general, largely unremarkable understanding of what I'd actually done across 26 years of service. Gregory grew up as a result with a fairly thin understanding of my career, knowing I'd served in Vietnam and then continued in some kind of administrative capacity, but never developing any real curiosity about the specifics, an understandable gap given how little I'd ever volunteered to fill it. He built his own career in commercial insurance sales, a field with its own visible, measurable markers of success, and he married his wife Ashley about a year ago, a woman I'd genuinely come to like during their courtship and the early months of their marriage, though our relationship remained, by necessity, still relatively new and developing. I want to be fair to Gregory here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as unkind, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted son, someone who calls regularly, who has always expressed general respect for my service, even if that respect was built on a considerably thinner understanding of the specifics than either of us, I think, fully realized until recently. What I've noticed, though, particularly since his marriage to Ashley, is a certain pattern in how Gregory discusses my financial circumstances, an assumption, unspoken but increasingly evident, that a retired command sergeant major living on a military pension necessarily meant modest, unremarkable financial resources, an assumption that had never once been directly tested against my actual situation, simply because the topic had never arisen in a context that required correction. 6 weeks ago, we gathered for a dinner celebrating Gregory and Ashley's first wedding anniversary, hosted at their home, a warm, genuinely happy occasion that I found myself enjoying considerably, watching my son build a life with a woman who seemed to bring out real warmth in him, the two of them clearly still in the comfortable, affectionate early stage of a marriage that felt genuinely promising. Ashley had prepared the meal herself, a detail she mentioned with evident pride, and the early part of the evening moved warmly, conversation drifting between their recent home improvements and plans for an upcoming vacation. About halfway through the dinner, the conversation turned, as these conversations sometimes do, toward long-term financial planning. Ashley mentioning that she and Gregory had recently begun discussing whether to start a family and what kind of financial support might realistically be available from either side of their extended family if unexpected circumstances arose. A fairly ordinary conversation between a young couple thinking seriously about their future together. Gregory, perhaps not fully thinking through how the comment would land, gestured toward me and said, with a casual, matter-of-fact tone that carried no apparent malice but landed with real weight nonetheless. Honestly, Dad's just a broke old veteran living off a small pension, so I wouldn't count on much financial help from that side of things if we ever really needed it. Not that we would ask, but just so you understand the general picture. He said it easily, almost affectionately, the way you might mention any ordinary fact about a parent's circumstances, clearly without any awareness of how the comment might land across the table. I sat there, 79 years old, holding my fork, absorbing the particular sting of having my entire financial situation, one I'd actually built with considerable care and discipline over the decades, casually characterized as insufficient to matter, spoken plainly in front of Ashley, a woman still building her own understanding of who I actually was, a woman whose entire perception of her new father-in-law was, in that moment, being quietly shaped by an assumption Gregory had apparently carried, unquestioned, for years. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. Men of my generation, particularly those who spent careers in the kind of quiet, administrative work that rarely generates recognition, develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own chosen discretion, across decades, had shaped my own son's understanding of who I actually was and what I'd actually built. I didn't correct him. I simply nodded, made a mild comment about living modestly by choice rather than necessity, and let the conversation move on to other topics, the way these moments often do, absorbed back into the general flow of a celebratory family dinner rather than confronted directly. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it eventually did. About 3 weeks after that dinner, Ashley mentioned, during a separate family gathering, that her own grandmother, recently moved into an assisted living facility, had asked Ashley to help sort through some old family belongings stored in her attic, a task that had apparently turned up a cedar box containing personal effects belonging to Ashley's late grandfather, a man named Walter Prescott, who had passed away when Ashley was still quite young, someone she'd only ever known through family stories rather than direct memory. Among the items in that cedar box, Ashley found a set of formal military discharge papers, documents she'd never seen before, describing her grandfather's service and the specific circumstances of his separation from the Army decades earlier. She mentioned, somewhat casually during that family gathering, that the papers included a signature at the bottom from a review officer she didn't recognize, someone named Harold Weaver, a detail she mentioned mostly in passing, curious whether the name meant anything to anyone in the family, given how coincidentally similar it sounded to my own. I felt something cold and strange move through my chest the moment she said that name, a recognition assembling itself before I'd even fully processed the specific details she was describing. "What years did your grandfather serve, Ashley?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Ashley gave me the details, dates, and a specific base assignment that I recognized immediately. Details that matched, with startling precision, a case I remembered reviewing personally during my final years in that administrative role. A case I remembered specifically because it had represented one of the more difficult judgment calls of my entire career. A young soldier named Walter Prescott, who had faced a serious disciplinary review following an incident that, on its surface, could easily have resulted in a dishonorable discharge, stripping him of every benefit and every shred of dignity he might have carried forward into the rest of his life. "Ashley," I said slowly, "I think I need to see those papers. I think I might know something about your grandfather's case that could matter quite a bit to you." 2 days later, Ashley brought the cedar box to my house, and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ruth and I had eaten 1,000 quiet meals together, and opened the folder containing Walter Prescott's discharge review, and there, at the bottom of the final page, was my own signature, dated 38 years earlier, in handwriting I recognized instantly as my own from that particular era of my career. I sat with that folder for a long moment before I said anything to Ashley, absorbing the strange, almost impossible symmetry of holding physical proof of a decision I'd made nearly 4 decades earlier, a decision that had, without either of us knowing it until this exact moment, quietly connected our two families long before Gregory and Ashley ever met. "Ashley," I said, "your grandfather was involved in a serious incident near the end of his service, one that technically could have resulted in a dishonorable discharge, which would have stripped him of his veteran's benefits, and frankly, a great deal of his dignity for the rest of his life. I reviewed the full context of that incident personally, and I found mitigating circumstances that his immediate chain of command hadn't fully accounted for. I made the case, in writing, that he deserved a general discharge instead, a recommendation that wasn't popular with some of the officers above him at the time. Without that decision, Ashley, your grandfather would have spent the rest of his life without full veterans' benefits, without the pension that likely supported your grandmother and your own mother through difficult years afterward, and very possibly without the ability to hold his head up in the way he apparently did for the rest of his life." Ashley's hands were trembling slightly as she read through the documents herself, her eyes finding the signature at the bottom, and I watched something shift behind her expression as the full weight of what she was looking at began to settle in. "This is you," she said quietly. "You're the reason my grandfather got to keep his benefits. You're the reason my grandmother and my mother had the support that got them through some genuinely hard years after he eventually passed. I don't tell you this to make you feel indebted to me, Ashley," I said. "I tell you this because you deserve to understand your own grandfather's story fully, and because I think it matters to something else entirely. 6 weeks ago, at your anniversary dinner, Gregory described me as just a broke old veteran living off a small pension, someone you shouldn't expect much from. I want you to understand something important, Ashley. My worth was never contingent on this discovery, on some coincidental connection to your own family history. I was already worthy of basic respect and consideration before any of this came to light. But I also want you to understand that the work I did during those years, the quiet, largely invisible administrative work Gregory has never fully understood or asked about, carried real weight that apparently shaped your own family's entire trajectory in ways neither of us had any idea about until today." Gregory arrived at my house about an hour later, having been called by Ashley once she'd processed enough of the discovery to want him to hear it directly. I watched his face move through a rapid, visible sequence of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked increasingly like genuine shame as Ashley walked him through what we'd just discovered together. "Dad," Gregory said, once Ashley had finished explaining, "I said you were just a broke old veteran 6 weeks ago, in front of Ashley, at our own anniversary dinner. I said that because I genuinely never thought to ask you real questions about what you actually did during those administrative years, and I built this whole assumption about your finances and your career based on absolutely nothing except a general stereotype about military pensions. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the discomfort of that realization sit a while longer, let him fully absorb the weight of what he'd said so carelessly weeks earlier. But I thought of Ruth, and the particular grace she always modeled in difficult family moments, and I found something steadier instead. "Gregory," I said, "I'm not upset because I need this discovery to validate my own worth. I never needed anyone's permission to know what those decisions meant, and I certainly didn't need a coincidental family connection to prove anything to myself about the work I did. But I do think you need to sit with something important, not because I want to punish you, but because I think you genuinely need to hear it. You made an assumption about my entire financial and professional life based on a category, retired military pension, without ever asking a single direct question that might have revealed a fuller picture. That's a pattern worth examining, Gregory, independent of whatever this specific discovery reveals about my own particular circumstances. You're right, Gregory said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. I think I've spent years measuring your worth through a fairly narrow, dismissive category, and I never once considered that the actual scope of what you'd contributed during your career might be considerably larger than whatever assumption I'd built about you. I'm ashamed of that comment, Dad, especially now, understanding what you actually did for Ashley's own family, decades before either of us knew we'd eventually be connected. We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Gregory and I had managed across his entire adult life. I told him, in detail I'd genuinely never shared with anyone outside a small circle of former colleagues, about the specific weight of that administrative work, about Walter Prescott's case specifically, about what it had actually felt like carrying responsibility for young men's entire futures during some of the most difficult moments of their military careers. I also, during that same conversation, shared something I'd never previously discussed with Gregory in any detail: the specific, careful financial planning Ruth and I had built together over the decades, disciplined saving and conservative investment that had, over time, produced a retirement considerably more comfortable than the broke old veteran characterization Gregory had carelessly offered at that anniversary dinner. I wasn't wealthy in any dramatic sense, but I was, by any reasonable measure, entirely secure, capable of providing genuine support if Gregory and Ashley ever needed it, a fact I'd simply never volunteered because the topic had never arisen in a way that required correction. In the 6 weeks since that discovery, something has genuinely shifted in how Gregory relates to me. He calls more often, not just for logistics, but to actually talk, asking real questions about my career, about specific cases I'd reviewed, about what it had actually felt like making decisions that shaped other men's entire futures. He's asked, more than once, whether I'd be willing to tell him more about that particular chapter of my service, curiosity that feels genuinely different from the polite, surface-level acknowledgement he'd maintained across most of his adult life. Ashley has become, in her own way, a bridge between us that I don't think either of us fully anticipated, asking me detailed questions about her grandfather, wanting to understand the fuller shape of his story now that she finally had access to it. She mentioned, during a recent visit, that she'd started researching her grandfather's specific unit and deployment history, wanting to build a more complete picture of the young man behind the discharge papers I'd once reviewed. Details, she said, had always felt frustratingly out of reach before this unexpected connection surfaced. Ashley's grandmother, once informed of the connection, asked specifically to meet me, and I visited her at her assisted living facility 2 weeks ago, a genuinely moving encounter, an elderly woman thanking me, with tears in her eyes, for a decision I'd made nearly 4 decades earlier that had shaped the entire remaining course of her own life alongside her husband's. Decades of stability and dignity she'd never fully understood the specific origin of, until this unexpected connection surfaced. She held my hand throughout much of that visit, telling me stories about Walter I'd never known, filling in, for both of us, pieces of a story that had existed, until that point, only as a single signature on an old document. Gregory has also, I've learned, started speaking differently about my career to his own friends and colleagues, describing me now with a considerably more accurate and respectful understanding, someone whose quiet administrative work had genuinely shaped young men's futures in ways that mattered enormously, even if the specifics remained, by necessity, somewhat general given the confidential nature of much of what I'd handled. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old veteran dismissed as broke at his own son's anniversary dinner. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The quiet, largely invisible work many of us do across our careers, work that never generates headlines or easy dinner table stories, often carries weight considerably more significant than the people closest to us have any way of knowing. simply because we ourselves, for whatever reason, professional discretion, simple habit, never gave them the material to understand differently. That doesn't mean our worth depends on some dramatic, coincidental discovery, eventually revealing the truth. It means dignity was already there, quietly, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to finally ask the right question. I spent 6 weeks being quietly dismissed as a broke old veteran by my own son, a characterization built entirely on assumption rather than any real inquiry into my actual circumstances. It turned out a decision I'd made 38 years earlier had already, without either of us knowing it, connected our family to the very woman my son would eventually marry, in ways that revealed exactly how wrong that careless assumption had been. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual worth you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.